Think about this for a second. When you walk into a doctor's office today, or sign up for a clinical trial, or even just pick up a new prescription from the pharmacy, there is a fundamental assumption that you are protected. You sign a stack of papers. You read the side effects. You give your consent. We treat the concept of informed consent like it is some kind of natural law. Like gravity, something that has always been woven into the fabric of American medicine. But here is the thing. It hasn't always existed. In fact, the legal requirement for scientists and the government to actually get your permission before experimenting on you did not exist until 1974. That means your grandparents, and in many cases your parents, lived in a completely different world when it came to medical rights. A world where the federal government, the military, and elite universities could, and routinely did, use American citizens as human guinea pigs. Without their knowledge, without their permission, and completely within the boundaries of the law. So, if there was no ban on human experimentation, no institutional review boards, no legal framework protecting the individual, how did medical research actually happen? The answer is darker, more complicated, and more revealing about the relationship between power, science, and the American citizen than most people realize. Because for the vast majority of American history, your body wasn't just your own. Under the right circumstances, it belonged to the state. And the road from that terrifying reality to the protections we have today is paved with radioactive injections, mind-control drugs, devastating government cover-ups, and millions of broken lives. Let me take you back. Way back. Before the Cold War, before the atomic bomb, to a time when doctors were treated like gods, and ordinary people were treated like raw materials. For most of human history, medical research was a brutally simple equation. If you wanted to cure a disease, you had to test the cure on a living, breathing human being. And because nobody actively volunteers to be injected with experimental viruses or untested chemicals, the medical establishment had to look for people who couldn't say no. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, America was rapidly industrializing. Cities were exploding with immigrants, orphanages were overflowing, and the poorhouses, which we've talked about before, were packed with people society had essentially discarded. These institutions weren't just warehouses for the poor, they were absolute gold mines for medical researchers. At this time, there was no Food and Drug Administration keeping a watchful eye on clinical trials. There were no federal laws dictating medical ethics. If a prominent doctor at a prestigious university wanted to test a new vaccine, they didn't ask for volunteers. They simply walked into a state-run orphanage, an insane asylum, or a prison, and they went to work. But the people inside these walls were considered wards of the state. They had no rights, no advocates, and no voice. This wasn't some rogue underground operation. It was the standard operating procedure of the medical establishment. In 1908, doctors in Philadelphia deliberately infected children at an orphanage with tuberculin to test a new reaction theory. Several of the children were permanently blinded. In 1911, a doctor at the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research injected 146 hospital patients, including children, with an experimental syphilis extract just to see what would happen. The patients were never told what was being put into their bloodstreams. Society turned a blind eye to this because the logic of the era was purely utilitarian. The authorities believed that if you were poor, disabled, or incarcerated, you were a burden on the state. Submitting your body to scientific research was viewed as your way of paying off your debt to society. The suffering of a few marginalized people was considered the necessary price for the greater good of public health. But as the 20th century dragged on, the scale of this experimentation was about to shift. It was going to move out of the local orphanages and asylums and into the highest, most secretive levels of the federal government. Because the world was about to go to war, and the weapons they were building required a totally different kind of test subject. In 1941, the United States entered the Second World War, and the nature of government power fundamentally changed. The military wasn't just fighting battles overseas, it was racing to build the ultimate weapon in secret. The Manhattan Project brought together the most brilliant minds on the planet to split the atom. But creating an atomic bomb introduced a terrifying new variable: radiation. Scientists knew that working with materials like plutonium and uranium was incredibly dangerous. But they didn't actually know how dangerous. If a worker at a secret facility accidentally inhaled plutonium dust, what would happen to them? How much radiation could the human body absorb before it shut down? The government needed hard data, and they needed it fast. But you can't just ask for volunteers to be injected with experimental radioactive elements. So, the government authorized top-secret human radiation experiments. They turned to the very hospitals that were supposed to be healing people. Starting in the mid-1940s, doctors working under government contracts began injecting patients with plutonium. These were not military personnel. They were everyday citizens who had checked into hospitals for completely unrelated issues. Broken bones, stomach ulcers, cancer. The patients were never told what was being put into their bodies. Take the case of Albert Stevens. In 1945, Stevens, a house painter from California, was diagnosed with stomach cancer. Without his knowledge or his consent, doctors working with the Manhattan Project injected him with a massive dose of plutonium. It was supposed to be a terminal dose. They just wanted to track how the radiation moved through his organs. But here is the most horrifying part. Stevens didn't actually have cancer. He had an ulcer. The doctors had misdiagnosed him. He lived for another 20 years, carrying the highest accumulated dose of radiation in any human being, while government doctors quietly collected his stool and urine samples to study the effects. The radioactive dawn arrived. The federal government had realized that national security could be used to justify almost anything. And as the Cold War began, the testing was about to get much, much worse. When the Second World War ended, the global landscape shifted overnight. The United States and the Soviet Union locked into the Cold War. It was an era defined by absolute paranoia. The fear of an imminent nuclear attack was so profound that it drove the American government to take increasingly desperate measures. They needed to understand everything about radioactive fallout, how it moved through the food supply, how it affected human genetics, and what it did to vulnerable populations. Because there were no laws forcing researchers to get permission, the government simply went looking for easy targets. Between the late 1940s and the 1960s, a devastating series of experiments unfolded across the country. In Tennessee, researchers fed pregnant women radioactive iron. The doctors told these expecting mothers that they were receiving a special vitamin drink designed to improve the health of their unborn babies. The truth was, the government wanted to measure how quickly radiation crossed the placenta and absorbed into fetal tissue. In Massachusetts, researchers working with the Atomic Energy Commission targeted children at the Walter E. Fernald State School, an institution for boys with developmental disabilities. The parents were sent letters telling them their sons had been selected for an exclusive science club. They were promised special trips to baseball games, extra portions of food, and better treatment. In reality, the boys were being fed oatmeal laced with radioactive calcium and iron. For decades, thousands of ordinary citizens became test subjects without a single piece of informed consent ever being signed. The researchers justified these actions by telling themselves they were fighting a hidden war for the survival of the American nation. They believed the potential threat of a Soviet nuclear strike made domestic casualties acceptable. The mindset was clear. Some people simply mattered less than the data they could provide. But testing the physical limits of the human body was only the beginning. As the global Cold War intensified, the government shifted its focus from the flesh to something far more dangerous. They decided they wanted to learn how to control the human mind. By the early 1950s, the Cold War had taken a bizarre and terrifying turn. American soldiers returning from the Korean War were suddenly confessing to crimes they never committed. The public was introduced to a chilling new word: brainwashing. The Central Intelligence Agency became convinced that the Soviet Union and China had discovered the secret to mind control. And the CIA decided that if a mind control weapon existed, the United States needed to own it first. In 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles approved a top-secret initiative that would become one of the most infamous government programs in human history: Project MKUltra. The goal of MKUltra was incredibly dark. The CIA wanted to find chemical and biological agents that could break human psychology. They wanted truth serums for interrogations. They wanted drugs that could induce amnesia, trigger extreme paranoia, or secretly program a single person to follow orders without question. To run this shadow program, the CIA appointed a brilliant chemist named Sidney Gottlieb. Gottlieb was given almost unlimited funding and zero oversight. He was allowed to operate completely outside the law. Because there were no regulations protecting human subjects, Gottlieb built a vast, invisible network of testing facilities. The CIA secretly funded research at over 80 institutions, including prestigious universities, elite hospitals, and federal prisons. At first, they tested their mind-altering drugs on vulnerable people like prisoners and drug addicts. In places like a federal penitentiary in Kentucky, inmates were bribed with heroin in exchange for taking experimental hallucinogens. But Gottlieb soon realized that testing people in controlled environments like prisons or hospitals was not giving him the real-world data he desperately wanted. If the CIA was going to use these drugs on foreign spies or enemy agents, they needed to know how a normal, unsuspecting person would react in public. They needed raw, unpredictable chaos. And so, the CIA made a decision that crossed every single moral boundary imaginable. They decided to take their experiments out of the laboratory. They decided to bring MKUltra directly into the streets of America. In the mid-1950s, the CIA began a covert sub-program known as Operation Midnight Climax. It sounds like the plot of a cheap spy thriller, but it was horrifyingly real. The agency set up a series of safe houses in San Francisco and New York. They hired sex workers and paid them to lure unsuspecting men back to these apartments. Once the men were inside, their drinks were secretly spiked with massive doses of LSD. Behind two-way mirrors, CIA agents sat drinking martinis, watching the men spiral into terrifying, drug-induced panic attacks. They took detailed notes on how the victims reacted to sudden psychological trauma. The men could not go to the police. Who would believe them? The absolute perfect crime had been beautifully engineered by the federal government itself. But the CIA did not stop with safe houses. They started slipping LSD into the drinks of regular Americans at bars, restaurants, and even beaches. You could be enjoying a simple, quiet evening out with friends, and suddenly, without warning, your entire reality would collapse. People suffered severe mental breakdowns. Some were institutionalized. Marriages were destroyed. And because nobody knew they had been dosed by their own government, many victims spent the rest of their lives believing they had simply gone insane. Even the CIA's very own people were definitely not safe. In 1953, during a secret retreat, Sidney Gottlieb spiked the after-dinner drink of a government biological weapons researcher named Frank Olson. Olson had absolutely no idea he was consuming a heavy dose of LSD. The drug triggered a severe crisis. Days later, Olson plunged to his death from a New York City hotel window. The government covered it up immediately. They told his grieving family that he had suffered a random nervous breakdown. It took 22 agonizing years for the Olson family to finally learn the terrifying truth. The government operated with absolute impunity. But while the CIA played reckless games with hallucinogens in the shadows, another federal branch was quietly running the longest, most brutal medical experiment in American history. And this one was hiding in plain sight. While the CIA was playing dangerous games with mind control in the 1950s, another branch of the federal government was already decades deep into the most brutal medical betrayal in American history. It did not involve secret agents or hidden safe houses. It happened right out in the open, entirely under the banner of public health. In 1932, the United States Public Health Service went to Macon County, Alabama. They were looking for subjects for a new study. They recruited 399 poor, black sharecroppers who were unknowingly suffering from a devastating disease, syphilis. The government doctors did not tell these men what was actually wrong with them. Instead, they told the men they were suffering from bad blood, a fake, catch-all term that meant absolutely nothing. In exchange for their participation, the men were promised free medical care, free hot meals, and free burial insurance. For families struggling through the Great Depression, this sounded like a miracle. But it was a trap. The government had absolutely no intention of curing these men. The true purpose of the study was horrifyingly simple. The researchers just wanted to watch what happens to the human body when syphilis is left completely untreated until death. They wanted to carefully track the blindness, the severe mental decay, the organ failure, and then, they wanted to perform autopsies. Now, in 1932, there was no safe cure for syphilis. But everything changed in the 1940s, when penicillin became widely available. It was a guaranteed, highly effective cure. This should have been the moment the study ended. The doctors could have simply given these men the antibiotic, cured them, and sent them home to their families. But they didn't. Instead, the massive federal government actively intervened to stop these men from ever getting penicillin. They contacted local doctors and the military, ordering them to deny treatment to the subjects. The researchers had decided that tracking the long-term data of human suffering was far more valuable than saving human lives. These men slowly went blind. They went completely insane. They unknowingly passed this deadly disease to their wives, and subsequently, to their newborn children. And the doctors just stood by, taking notes. This unbelievable cruelty simply did not last for a few months, or even a few years. The government kept this quiet nightmare going for 40 years, until someone on the inside finally decided to break the silence. For decades, the dark underbelly of American medical research operated in absolute secrecy. The scientists running the Tuskegee study, the CIA agents dosing citizens with LSD, and the doctors injecting patients with radioactive isotopes all believed they were untouchable. They thought the American public would simply never find out. But secrets have a way of eventually breaking free. In the mid-1960s, a young social worker named Peter Buxton was hired by the Public Health Service. While reviewing medical records, he stumbled across the Tuskegee files. He was absolutely horrified. Buxton realized his own agency was deliberately letting hundreds of men die for a completely unnecessary experiment. He filed an official protest, demanding the study be shut down immediately. The response he got was chilling. The Centers for Disease Control formed a special committee to review his complaint. But instead of stopping the study, they actively voted to continue it. They insisted that the data was just too precious to lose. Buxton simply refused to give up. He waited patiently, gathering undeniable evidence. Finally, in 1972, he leaked the entire story to a reporter named Gene Heller at the Associated Press. When the story hit the front pages of newspapers across the country, the public reaction was explosive. People everywhere were completely sickened. How could the powerful government of the United States casually treat its own vulnerable citizens like disposable lab animals? And the timing was critical. The country was already reeling from the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal. Trust in the massive federal government system was rapidly collapsing. And suddenly, the floodgates opened. Following the Tuskegee revelation, other whistleblowers began stepping out of the shadows. Details of the CIA's mind control programs and the secret radioactive tests slowly started leaking into the press. The illusion was entirely shattered. The angry American people finally realized they had no legal protection against the scientists and politicians running the country. The pressure became overwhelming. Congress knew they had to do something fast before the public completely lost faith in the medical establishment. A massive, unprecedented turning point in American history had finally arrived. By 1973, the federal government was in full panic mode. The terrifying headlines just kept coming. Americans were furious, demanding answers. They wanted to know how doctors, the very people sworn to do no harm, had been allowed to operate like rogue scientists in a horror movie. Congress was forced to act. They held massive, highly publicized hearings. The testimonies were absolutely chilling. Government officials were forced to sit under the bright lights and admit that yes, they had secretly tested on their own citizens. And yes, it was all completely legal. To stop the bleeding, Congress passed a monumental piece of legislation. On July 12, 1974, President Richard Nixon officially signed the National Research Act into law. This single document changed American medicine forever. For the very first time in history, the federal government legally required researchers to get voluntary, informed consent from human subjects. You could no longer just sneak experimental drugs into a patient's IV bag. You had to explain the extreme risks, detail the exact procedures, and get a signature. The law also created institutional review boards, or IRBs. These were independent ethics committees mandated to heavily scrutinize every single proposed human experiment. If the board felt a study was too dangerous or unethical, they possessed the absolute power to shut it down instantly. The era of the untouchable doctor was finally over. The government could no longer view the poor, the sick, or the incarcerated as expendable property. The American citizen was officially recognized as a human being with fundamental rights, legally protected against the dark ambitions of scientific progress. But while this new law successfully stopped the absolute worst abuses, it left behind a profound, unsettling question that still haunts us deeply today. We must never, ever forget what really happened during those years. When we look back at this horrific timeline, we have to face a very uncomfortable reality. The modern medical advancements that we all rely on today, the life-saving vaccines, the complex radiation therapies, the deep understanding of infectious diseases, they were essentially paid for in the blood, the sanity, and the silent suffering of thousands of unknowing American citizens. The laws are incredibly strict now, thankfully. You cannot legally be tested on without your explicitly documented permission. But the relationship between supreme institutional power, advanced science, and the everyday citizen will always remain incredibly fragile. The true lesson of this history is that absolute power naturally seeks absolute control. And whenever powerful institutions are allowed to operate entirely in the shadows without public oversight, the fundamental rights of regular people are always the first thing to disappear. If this story shifted your perspective on how governments really operate, make sure to subscribe to the channel and drop a like on this video. We go deep on these kinds of hidden power structures, the ones that quietly shape your world in ways most people never think about. Stay curious, stay vigilant, and I will see you in the next one.